Queen Marika the Eternal is a deity of unmatched mystique and power. She is the vessel for the Elden Ring, the mother of demigods, ruler of the lands between, and vassal of the greater will. Our goal from the very start has been to repair the Elden Ring, repair Marika, who sits broken inside the Erd Tree, so that we can ascend and become Elden Lord. Marika has always been the catalyst for the events of our story. She's responsible for the shattering, as she brought her hammer down on the Elden Ring. She set our story in motion. It's easy to see this woman, this god, and imagine her motivations to be unknowable to mere mortals. But thanks to Shadow of the Erd Tree, those hidden truths have been uncovered. And what we found is the story of a victim of genocide, who refused to allow her oppressors to take her life, as they did the rest of her people. Queen Marika the Eternal and her people, the shamans, once sat at the absolute bottom of society, which makes her ascension all the more extraordinary. Thank you for joining us for the latest episode in our ongoing Elden Ring lore series, where we explore the places, people, and gods of the lands between, and the Land of Shadows. Whether this is your first time finding the channel, or you're a longtime subscriber, thank you for checking us out. If you want to keep up with our explorations of the lore of Shadow of the Erd Tree, please consider subscribing, as we plan on focusing on DLC-related content for the foreseeable future. We're always keeping an eye on the comments as well, so feel free to suggest the topics you'd like us to dive into. If you want to discuss your lore theories with a community of FromSoft fans, please join the Discord, as we put together a fun group of people. Whether you subscribe or not, your viewership is more than enough for us. And with that said, let's dive into the history of Marika and the shaman, and maybe even touch on how it affects the future of the lands between. The history of the shamans is the history of Queen Marika. They are a race of people originating from the Land of Shadows. The shamans were born without horns, and were thought to be both inferior and divine simultaneously by the Hornsent. This divinity gave them a place in the ancient rituals of the Hornsent, but that place was one of blood, sacrifice, and horror. Upon reaching Bonnie Village, we see how exactly the Hornsent treated the shaman people. They were nothing more than sacrifices, lambs to the slaughter. In this village roam the greater potentates, who take on a much more menacing tone now that we know of their true origins. Previously, Jarbairn told us that a potentate was simply someone with smooth hands who protected the jars. Now we know that they were actually butchers, much more reminiscent of Anastasia Tarnished Eater. These enemies carry only 2 items and are otherwise naked, possibly as part of their ritual. The potentates wield the Bonnie butchering knife, an outsized butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of great jars stored in jails. They also wear the caterpillar mask, which is a grotesque mask constructed from countless solidified caterpillars, a ritual implement of the greater potentates of Bonnie Village, used to ward off thoughts of impurity, doubt, temptation, and other wickedness one is vulnerable to while absorbed in divine ritual. An interesting note here is that the same mask is worn by Hornsent, our companion, as we search for kindly Miquella, so it seems he too may have been a potentate in his past. We can start to see a picture being painted of just what the Hornsent did to the shamans, but nearby there's a shack that gives us even more detail on these matters. When we reach the whipping hut, we find the tooth whip and a wandering spirit. This spirit seems trapped in a moment from their life, speaking the words, "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood awaits within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life you were accorded for this alone." The tooth whip sheds light on this statement. Whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip, and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. So the Hornsent potentates engaged in these rituals, where they would butcher the shamans and stuff them into jars so that their flesh could meld together and create some new form of life, and this process was seen as divine. The final confirmation of this comes from the item Innered Meat, which can be found in each jail. Scraps of flesh for filling great jars. Rancorous spirits cling to the pinkish-red twitching meat, throw at enemies to inflict damage. This is what becomes of the condemned, who get sliced up and stuffed into jars to become saints instead. It seems some shaman actually believed in this practice, as the Great Jar Helm tells us it is a great jar which fits comfortably over the head when upturned. Attire of the shamans who perform their worship at jails. They offer their prayers to the innards of the great jars, such that they might be reborn one day into sainthood. This is the cycle of death and rebirth, taken into the hands of mortal men. Some of the shamans kept in jails seem to think the innards of these jars would someday achieve sainthood, whatever that meant for them. But I have a different theory. While the shamans in jails may have thought this process would end in sainthood, there are also hornsent inside these jails. A spirit of one of these hornsent can be found, and they say, "Oh please, not the jar, anything but that. I promise I won't ever do it again. I swear a living saint I'll surely be. Please, you must forgive me. Forgive me, please." Hornsent and shaman alike were placed within the jars, but I believe the hornsent were only placed in them after the shamans became the hideous amalgams of flesh we see whenever their jars are opened. These things all appear female and bear a striking resemblance to Queen Marika herself. When they attack us, they grab us with flesh and pull us in, trying to assimilate us into the mass. What I think this all comes back to is the idea of all life being conjoined within the crucible, and what that would mean for the hornsent should they want to achieve godhood. If we take a look at the Gate of Divinity from both the cinematic trailer of Shadow of the Erdtree and the final boss area of the game, we see bodies melded together in mounds of flesh. Among these bodies we see both shaman and hornsent, which to me reads as their understanding of the divine rituals being about conjoining life in order to open the gates to godhood. Perhaps this is how the hornsent believed they could become closer to the crucible, by using these people with malleable bodies to meld together life itself through divine right. This is where we stand in our understanding of the treatment of the shamans, and perhaps this would be the way things always were, had a young woman not been born amongst them, who was chosen as an Empyrean by her own 2 fingers. With the birth of Marika, the wheels of change were set in motion. Change and revenge. Marika was likely born to an area just past the Shadowkeep, known as the Shaman Village, where her people presumably lived in relative peace until the day they were taken away for the slaughter. At some point, the 2 fingers chose her as an Empyrean, capable of ascending to godhood, and Marika used this to eventually bring that dream to fruition, but we don't know exactly how she was able to do this. The Empyrean Grand Dame refers to her as a strumpet, which implies Marika may have used her feminine charm in order to work her way up the ladder of royalty and attain her goals. This lines up well with the cinematic trailer, where Letta tells us Miquella spoke of the seduction and betrayal, an affair from which gold arose. However, given the hornsent's hatred of Marika, I do believe this interpretation should be taken with a grain of salt. Regardless, Marika used the gateway to become the vessel for the Elden Ring and ascend to godhood, possibly with the intention of ruling over a land where her people would never experience the cruelty of the Land of Shadows again. A land with no death, bathed in honeyed rays of gold. When it comes to how Marika was able to ascend, I believe I have a solid theory. In order to become a god, one must have prepared a lord and a vessel. For Miquella, the lord was Radahn and the vessel was Mohg, and he himself became a god. For Marika, I believe that through the use of her shaman flesh, she was able to act as both vessel and god, ascending to godhood, while also acting as a vessel for her lord, Radagon. This would explain their duality, 2 people sharing one body, and their nature as 2 people in one could also be the reason for their children's afflictions. Mesmer born with his flames in the abyssal serpent, Melina born burned and bodiless, Melania born with the scarlet rot, and Miquella born with eternal youth. I believe that after she ascended and opened a door to the lands between, Marika took one last trip back home. She walked to the center of her village and cast a secret incantation, Minor Erdtree, an incantation she would pass down to her daughter, Melina. Secret incantation of Queen Marika, only the kindness of gold, without order, creates a small illusory Erdtree that continuously restores the HP of nearby allies. Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. There was no one left for Marika to say goodbye to. The rest of the shaman were either used in divine rituals or followed Marika out of the Land of Shadows and became known as the Newmen. But she had one last place where she needed to pay her respects. In front of a wooden carving of a woman within a tree trunk, we find the golden braid. A braid of golden hair cut loose, Queen Marika's offering to the grandmother, boosts holy damage negation by the utmost. What was her prayer, her wish, her confession? There's no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. Perhaps this grandmother was like a deity to the shaman, because this is where Marika left a portion of her golden hair. This braid is the reason every depiction of Marika shows her with hair longer on one side than the other. She left this piece of herself out of respect for her home, her traditions, and after this, she never set foot in the village of her birth again. This is not where the story ends though, as we know Marika would later wage war on the Land of Shadow, and pay back their atrocities against her people tenfold. For a time, the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow must have existed alongside one another. We know from the remembrance of the Wild Boar Rider that Mesmer and Gaius were like older brothers to Radahn, so it stands to reason that at least up to the point where Radahn was studying gravity sorceries, Mesmer resided in the Lands Between. It would be some time between Radahn's studies and the Shattering that Marika would send her son to the Land of Shadow, in order to purge the lands and hide the secret of her history. I think in terms of the timeline, if we're to assume that my theory of Radagon and Marika merging at the Divine Gate is correct, she'd want to do this before she called on Radagon to be the next Elden Lord, so that the secret of their union would be well kept. This would lead to the purge of the Land of Shadows, Mesmer's flames stretching across the land and taking the horn scent with them. This plan was twofold, as while Marika cared for her son as seen in the description of Marika's blessing, she needed Mesmer to be hidden away within the realm of shadow, due to his affliction with his very flame, and the hatred he could not confine. She also set out to show the Hornson exactly what it was like to live in a world where your people were used as nothing but fodder for another who considered you inferior. The Furnace Golems can be seen as part of Mesmer's assault during the trailer for Shadow of the Erdtree, and we find them in each area of the Land of Shadow. These giant enemies are burning the bodies of so many horn scent in order to stay lit, and through the Furnace Visage and the Hefty Furnace Pot, we learn more about them. A smaller imitation of the Furnace Golem's visage, a stone mask surrounded by curled horns, depicting the fell god of fire that haunts the sagas of the horn scent. Craftable item prepared using a capacious cracked pot, imbued with the hex of the furnace, thrown at an enemy to create a whirlwind of flame. The furnace's flame burns away both body and soul. When impurity is thus expunged, one calls it cleansing. So the horn scent know of the fell god's flame, and they fear it because it burns not only body, but soul, and their entire religion seems to be based around spirits. Every horn scent body used to keep the fires burning is a mirror to every shaman body cut up and used in pot rituals. Marika traded divine ritual for cleansing ritual, and the horn scent would know what it was to have no power over their own fate. In this way, Queen Marika the Eternal, who strove to create a land without death, where all could live in harmony, proved herself a hypocrite, unable to put the past behind her. She perpetuated the cycle of violence instead of rising above, and ultimately, it's up to us to consider whether or not this was justified. From what we know of cycles, it seems likely that kindly Miquella's new world would fall to the same hypocrisy over time. So maybe it's best that a Tarnish sets a new course for the lands between, and ascends to the throne of the Elden Lord. Before wrapping this up, I had a few other thoughts about how Marika's past as a shaman came to shape the lands between. I believe the new revelation that shaman flesh was malleable actually shed some light on grafting, as well as Rykard's ability to take control of the world-eating serpent. Godric the Grafted attempted to make himself more powerful by grafting the parts of great warriors onto his own body, and perhaps it was the flesh he inherited from his lineage that allowed him to practice this art in the first place. As far as we see, only Godric himself practices grafting, and we assume his scions likely share his lineage, which means he would have been able to graft them. When it comes to Rykard, being devoured by the serpent should have spelled the end for him, but through the power of his great rune he retained himself and was able to take control. But what if it was not just the great rune, but his very body that made it possible for him to become the blasphemous creature we do battle with? The serpent grows Rykard's arms, and his face is protruding from its neck. To me, this lines up with how shaman flesh is able to conjoin to the flesh of others. Finally, kindly Miquella seemed to be casting aside every piece of himself in order to achieve godhood. I believe this is the inverse of how his mother achieved her goal, as Miquella did not use his shaman flesh to meld with the Lord. Rather, he divested himself of the very body that made him a shaman, and instead came to be what looks like a pure golden spirit. Perhaps we'll discuss this more thoroughly at some point in the future. Queen Marika the Eternal likely suffered a life of indignity before ascending to godhood. Her people were used as fodder for divine ritual, some even thinking they would reach a higher plane if they just believed hard enough in the power of the jars. I think Marika saw through this, especially as an Empyrean with her own two fingers guiding her path. She would find her way to the divine gate by using every resource she had at her disposal, and take godhood for herself, regardless of the consequences. And with power like that, power to crush one's enemies, those who wronged her and her people, the temptation was too great. Marika did not attack the Land of Shadow right away. She lived alongside this land and its people until the day of her betrayal, when she ordered it be set ablaze by the flames of her first son. Marika, the shaman girl chosen by fate, took her revenge on the Hornsent, and by exploring the Land of Shadow, we come to understand the consequences of these actions, and the path it set her youngest son on to right her wrongs and take godhood for himself. Thank you for joining us as we explored the history of Queen Marika the Eternal, from her humble roots in the shaman village to the purging of the Land of Shadow. What did you think of our timeline of these events? Do you believe Marika used her shaman flesh as a way to become a vessel for her Lord Radagon? What did the Hornsent hope to achieve by melding life using the bodies of the shaman to create the Divine Gate? Was Marika's betrayal her attack on the Land of Shadow, or her taking godhood for herself as a lowly shaman? What was the prayer Marika uttered before leaving her home forever? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and set notifications to all so you never miss out on any of our lore dives. We look forward to seeing you again for more Elden lore.